Okay, so another episode of Moon Knight is officially out, and I've been waiting for this one for a long time, due to the big plot twist that was set to hit us like Marc punching Steven. So without further ado, let's get into it. Another week, another episode that certainly did not disappoint. In fact, a lot of big stuff happened in this episode. Big reveals, big holes, big mysterious white rooms, and big anthropomorphic hippos? Yup. We open this episode in a temple where one of the avatars from last week's episode puts the statuified Khonshu among 9 others, perhaps the 9 gods of the Ennead. In this episode, Layla gets some badass action sequences from the very start and all the way throughout. Though I will say the person on the turret must have had the aim of a stormtrooper since they couldn't hit her carrying Steven unconscious, or while she was just, standing still. The developing relationship between Steven and Layla allows for some great comedic moments in this episode, especially when depicting the internal struggle between Marc and Steven, in particular when Steven gets punched by Marc with his own hand, which was a nice comedic relief after I had to sit through what was probably the most awkward kiss on television. This episode feels the most Tomb Raider, Indiana Jones, The Mummy-esque so far. And I've got to say, there were some sequences that were actually just downright scary, which is really nice to see from a Marvel project. It gives me a lot of faith for things like Blade and Werewolf by Night, which I'm hoping Moon Knight will make an appearance in. As I'm sure was expected, this episode takes a massive dive into Egyptian mythology, which is just fascinating to me. I also love it when the MCU mixes its own history with real-world history. And we get to see an example of that with Alexander the Great's tomb, as we learn that he in fact was an avatar of Ammit. This episode goes a little more into Marc's origin as Moon Knight, more specifically the day he died. This is something I feel like we'll explore even more in next week's episode, along with some even earlier points in his life, like his time in the military, and even as far back as his childhood. His parents have been cast for the show as they were seen at the premiere, so it's only a matter of time before we get some flashbacks. And what better time and place for that than in Marc's mindscape on his journey to resurrection. Now, if you watched Will's episode 3 breakdown video, he mentioned how he thought that Layla's history would be much more important than most would presume. In this episode, we find out that her father was killed by Marc's partner during his time as a mercenary, leading to a bit of conflict between the already distant couple. In the comics, Marc's partner was Raoul Bushman, who killed the lead archaeologist to find an Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. Spectre then punched Bushman to protect a woman by the name of Marlene, and that's when Marc was mortally wounded by Bushman and left to die, shortly before he was resurrected as the Fist of Khonshu. In finding out this information from Harrow, Layla goes to confront Marc, who had just found the imprisoned statue of Ammit. This conflict leaves Harrow and his men enough time to get to them. Marc and Harrow have a little showdown in the tomb, leading to Marc getting shot and presumably dying. Now in the comics, he's died 3 times, so nothing new there. Immediately after Marc is shot, we see him in a near catatonic state, strapped to a wheelchair in a bright white room in a mental institution as a patient, with all previous characters from the show returning to play either patients or carers, evoking that of something like 1920s German expressionist film The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, of which the protagonist finds himself in the exact same position in the big final plot twist. Marc is strapped to a wheelchair, much like he strapped himself to his bed, holding a Moon Knight action figure. On the TV is what we later find out to be Marc's favourite film, a cheesy Indiana Jones style rip-off movie whose protagonist's name is Stephen Grant. Along with Caligari, the ending seems to be heavily inspired by Jeff Lemire's Moon Knight run, where Marc wakes up in a mental asylum where he's made to believe that his caped adventures as the vigilante Moon Knight were merely a figment of his imagination. In the comics, this asylum is overseen by a woman by the name of Dr. Emmett, who is later revealed to be Ammit. Yup, real original. The 2 carers of this asylum are Billy and Bobby, which just so happens to be the carers in the show's asylum and the name of the 2 police we saw earlier in the show. In the comic, he was made to believe that he'd been in the asylum since he was 12, and it was only until he started getting visions of Khonshu telling him to remember who he is that he started to piece together his fractured psyche. Donning a pillowcase for a mask and bedsheets as a costume, fighting his way out of the asylum that turned out to be an illusion located in a reality outside of time and space. Between the inclusion of almost every character in the show so far, visual nods to earlier episodes, and even imagery of familiar places, Moon Knight has been foreshadowing this twist from the very beginning, but it seems as if it did so in more ways than we thought. In fact, if you look back to the sequence where Steven is kidnapped and taken to Harrow's cult base in episode 2, as Layla and Steven attempted to escape, they ran through a corpse-filled room. This mysterious storage room almost perfectly resembles Arthur Harrow's office space in the asylum, with an obvious change in decor, but from an architectural standpoint, the locations are identical. I'm guessing in the next episode, he and Steven, with the help of a newly discovered and much more violent personality, will have to regain control of this whole situation in order to return to the mortal plane. Speaking of that other personality, Jake Lockley was almost revealed at the end of this episode. In the same way Marc found Steven in a sarcophagus, there was another one with someone else inside trying to escape. With both the show and actor Oscar Isaac teasing at a third personality making an appearance, it's safe to say that next week we will finally get to meet the darker side of Marc and Steven's trio. Another thing that this episode alludes to that might become quite important in the future is Layla becoming the Scarlet Scarab. In the comics, the Scarlet Scarab was a man by the name of Abdul Faul, but with Layla's full name being Layla Abdallah al-Fawli, her nickname being Little Scarab, and now with her wearing a thimble with a red scarab symbol on it in the Asylum sequence, it's safe to assume that Marvel could well be setting her up to become the MCU's Protector of Egypt. The final thing we see in this episode is a giant anthropomorphic hippopotamus. Try saying that 3 times as fast. Which happens to be Taweret, the Egyptian goddess of childbirth and fertility, who also has the powers to bring back the deceased and therefore bring Marc and Steven back to life. We actually got a tease for Taweret in episode 1 when Steven was at work and moving some Taweret plushies in the storage room. Okay, so that about wraps up this week's Moon Knight breakdown. I'm absolutely loving this show and each week just gets me more and more excited. In fact, I've not been this hyped up to write and record a breakdown video since WandaVision. I'm sure next week's episode will be a hell of a ride, so make sure to tune back into the channel for our breakdown and review. But until then, I've been Brandon, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw here today, then maybe consider subscribing to catch our other content as and when it releases.